Thank you all for joining us. I'm here today. I have the honor of being joined with Jane Birkenhead of Birkenhead English.
Yes,
Right?
that's
Yeah.
right.
And she's here to teach us about the TOEFL listening. So just really quickly, I just wanted to introduce you, Jane, and ask, how long you've been teaching TOEFL, and maybe a couple details about what you're going to teach us today.
Okay, I've been teaching TOEFL for the last 5 years. So I work exclusively with exams preparation students. I don't do any other kind of teaching. And in today's lesson, I'm going to look at listening and note-taking, but combining the two things and the reasons why it's so difficult, and then looking at strategies to help overcome some of those difficulties.
That sounds great. And students ask us all the time about note-taking. It's hard to listen and take notes at the same time. So I think a lot of people benefit from it.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's really difficult.
It is. Yeah, even for me, I have trouble with it. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah, so I'm excited to hear about it. So please take it away. Let me hear about note-taking for the listening, or just in general note-taking.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll share my screen and I'm just going to go into presentation. Okay, so we've got our little thumbnails up here. I don't know how they actually appear on the recording. It may be that they're somewhere different.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, okay. So let's jump in and look at the strategy, look at the goal for this mini lesson. Okay, so the strategies that we're going to look at are the strategies that involve listening and note-taking, but specifically in TOEFL situations. Because one of the really big problems about listening and note-taking is that it is hard. A lot of people are, sort of a little embarrassed about the reasons for it being hard, but it is definitely recognized as being something difficult. The reason is because humans are not very good at multitasking. However, this is presented in lovely magazine articles that tell you should multitask, it's actually really difficult. And the reason that it's difficult is because of this thing called the cognitive load. Now, we don't really need to worry too much about this term that it's given by psychologists. But what it really means is that there is a lot of pressure on your working memory while you're trying to multitask. And that is even before we throw in the stress and the nerves that come in the exam situation. So if it is something that you're finding difficult, then, it's perfectly natural that you should find it difficult. But let's explore some of the reasons for this. So a lot of students talk about what they find difficult about listening and note-taking. And these are some of the common issues that I've heard recently. So I take lots of notes, but I can't actually read them. I can't understand them once I've finished. I take notes, then that means that I'm missing information. I don't know what to take notes of. The lecturer is talking so quickly and there is so much information that I just don't know what to focus on. And then I really can't do all this at the same time. And it's kind of crazy to think that I should be able to do it at the same time.
Yeah, that's the one I hear the most. I can't do it all at one time.
Right. So let's sort of talk a little bit about why we're in this situation to start with, and how a lot of advice for TOEFL comes about. So TOEFL is a university preparation exam. It's used by professional licensing bodies as well, but a lot of the information about how to succeed in TOEFL comes from academic English situations. And a lot of this information is not particularly helpful. It's kind of been adapted from academic English and used in terms of general strategies for TOEFL. But if we look at the differences between the two situations, so when you're in a university lecture, your job is to write down as much as possible that the professor says. You want a summary of what the professor is saying. The reason is because you don't know what you're actually going to do with that information. You don't really know what assignments the professor will give or how you're going to use that information in the future. And this is the other thing. You're actually taking notes in university lectures, and you're taking notes for long term. So, by that I mean a semester, a couple of semesters, but you're talking about a few weeks, possibly a few months that you need this information for. TOEFL lectures are completely different, because we know in TOEFL lectures that the focus is on listening for the main idea and the details. That's our job. That's what we're concerned with. We know what we're going to do with that information. If it's a listening lecture, we're going to answer questions on the material that we've just heard. If it's a speaking response or a writing assignment, we're going to use that information to interpret, to re-explain what we've just heard, so we know what we're doing with it. And also, we're using it in the short term. So when you actually consider the advice that's given for academic strategies such as note-taking and listening, because a lot of it is adapted from academic situations, a lot of it is not really that suitable for TOEFL students. So let's look, first of all, this is just a picture. I'm just going to sort of hide our little thumbnails here so that you can see the entire picture. It's just really some notes that I made before. It's just an example of my note-taking, but I think it's helpful if we separate note-taking and then note-taking while you're listening. Let's focus on the actual notes themselves to start with. There we go. So really, when you're taking notes for the TOEFL exam, there's a few things that you should remember. They are for your use. They are nobody else's. You are not going to be judged or assessed on the notes that you take. They actually get destroyed after the exam. Nobody looks at them. They get shredded. So it's not even like they are looked at and someone goes, oh, they're not very good notes or anything like that. They are immediately destroyed. Nobody looks at them. So my main advice in all of this is really do what works for you. There are a lot of strategies that people tell you about, a lot of things that get very complicated when you try and break down what those strategies are. But I think that everyone who is doing the TOEFL exam has been through years and years of education to get to that point. You probably have a pretty good system of note-taking anyway. So you don't need to learn an entirely new system. You can refine your system, you can change it a little bit, make it a little bit more suitable for the situation. But I don't think that you need to worry about learning an entirely new system. So my main message really in all of this is to do what works for you. Your ultimate goal is to get the information that you need and either answer the listening questions, speak your response, or complete your essay. That's your ultimate goal. So all the time, think about what the ultimate goal is in this. But some helpful ideas when you're taking notes. I find it really useful to spread out over the entire page. All the examples that you see are examples of my writing. My writing is quite big, and it's deliberately like that because I find it much, much easier to read my own notes if I spread out over the page. I use systems of organizing. So I use a numbering system, or I'll write little bullet points, something like that. So it's good even if you're not using any abbreviations or anything like that, just actually organizing your notes so that you can easily see what the first thing the professor says, what the second thing the professor says is. You want to be able to find that. There's a lot of discussion about the kind of writing to use. Joined up writing can be faster than printing, but I wouldn't worry too much about it if that doesn't come naturally to you. But the final point, practice writing notes with a pencil, because in the TOEFL exam, you do get a pencil, and they're normally sort of like really short little funny pencils. And it's just different. If you're always used to writing with a pen, it's just different. So definitely practice that, writing with a pencil.
Nice, good. Yeah, I never thought about that before. I was going to ask you.
Yeah, sorry.
What's joined up writing? I don't think I've heard.
Oh, okay. So in some situations, I believe that people refer to it as cursive writing. So it's if you sort of look at some of my letters on here, they're kind of linked into the next letter. So it's just, if printing is when they're very separate, but if you join up the letters, it means you're not lifting your pencil away from the paper. And I mean, we're talking microseconds, but sometimes that makes a difference.
I see. You know, and also one thing I noticed is that you wrote all the words out. So sometimes when I give advice on taking notes, I tell them to, you know, don't write any vowels down.
Right.
Few vowels or something like that. Is that something you would recommend, or not really usually?
Again, I think that comes down to personal choice. So actually in my notes that I've got here that I'm referring to, one of the things that I say is that the idea of missing out the vowels, for me, that's actually really difficult. And I find that I spend more time working out the vowels to miss out and then working out what the word should be than just quickly writing the word in the first place. But I think it's down to the individual. If that's something that you feel you can work with, if it's something that you definitely find helpful, by all means, go ahead and do it.
Right. Yeah.
You know, this is definitely about making it so that you can do something with it. It's not about using a system because you think that's the proper system. There isn't a proper system. It's really down to the individual.
Right. I think that's great advice. Yeah, and I think that's something that gets forgotten. That, you know, I give a lot of advice, and then sometimes people say, well, you know, you said this, but this other teacher said that. You know, and neither one is wrong. You know,
exactly.
like it's really like a language test. You know, so that there's kind of, you know, a lot of different ways of articulating something, of answering something, especially for speaking and writing.
Yes.
And so yeah, I think that's great advice. That, you know, this is advice, or these are some ideas, but it's not, you know, infallible. You know, there's other ways to go about it. And so yeah, I think that's great. And also, you know, practice with a pencil. I never really thought of that before.
I was shocked in the TOEFL exam that I did that I was given one of these pencils and it was tiny, and it was a real surprise. Someone had told me, oh yes, you know, you need to use a pencil. So I was prepared for that, but I wasn't prepared for the sort of like tiny little pencils that they gave out. So yeah, it's about knowing what you're going to be facing and doing as much as you can to prepare yourself for that.
That's great.
Okay, so talked a little bit about missing out vowels. Abbreviations. A lot of people focus on abbreviations and say, you should definitely use abbreviations, they will help. Personally, I definitely do think that they help. I use them a lot, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But one of the big sources of confusion is, do you really remember what they mean? And here are some examples of abbreviations that can get confused for other abbreviations, especially the first one, because I think example, exam, experiment, even exercise, those are words that we hear a lot in TOEFL questions. And if you're not careful and you're talking about an example, or are you talking about an experiment, it's very easy when you read your notes back to get confused. So if you are going to use a system of abbreviation, then just make sure that you work out what it is. Make sure that you're comfortable, that you're familiar with it, that you're not just doing it because someone else said that it was a good idea. You may have to practice a few times to get really comfortable with it if it is something new for you. But then having said that, these are some of the abbreviations and symbols that I do use. So on the left-hand side, it's things that I've used for as long as I've been studying. But the right-hand side of this paper is really the stuff that I use the most. So I underline if something is important. If it's really important, it gets lots of underlines. Or I circle it, I use asterisks, I use arrows to join up information. I use symbols as much as I possibly can, so equals, not equals. I haven't actually got it on here, but I use positive and negative for exactly the same purpose. And then I either number points or I use bullet points to separate them. And I find bullet points useful because even if I'm not sure if it's the first thing that the professor is mentioning or it's like the first point of the second point, the third point or whatever, I find that I can separate my information with bullet points. And I use that a lot.
Nice.
So definitely they can be helpful. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if these are when I think of abbreviation, I think of like the shorter part in the beginning, like you said, like EX or RES or something like that. I guess these are, but yeah, like symbols. Yeah, and so these are some symbols that you find useful, and the bullet points I find very useful. I usually use a hyphen, but yeah, it's the same thing.
Yeah,
that like ordering the lines, like each line should have a piece of information is something I usually tell the students that, like, so you don't want to put two pieces of information together on one line, so to speak. So you use these kind of bullet points or hyphens or whatever to separate information.
Yeah, actually, that is a really good point. You see, this is why this is so good. I hadn't thought about that. But yes, separating the information line by line makes a lot of sense. Definitely. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, and I was going to say, again, with this, it's about making something work for you. I mean, I've got a science background, so I'm used to using symbols and things like this. But if you don't feel comfortable, if this is something that you feel is more complicated and actually is making you stressed, it's kind of making you focus more on the note-taking rather than on listening, then don't worry about it. Move on. Find something that does work.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So one thing I was going to ask, and I guess it kind of goes back to, what works for you. But, is there like on each line, like how many words should you have each line, or, you should, so like usually, for example, I usually tell students that you shouldn't have more than you probably shouldn't have more than like 7 words or something per line, because if it gets too much information on one line, it might get a little confusing. And I think that goes back to what you said with kind of spreading out your notes.
Yes.
It's just at least that so they can kind of, the information can breathe a little bit.
Yeah, I'll come on to this a little bit more later on.
Okay.
But I definitely think that the tendency is to write too much. And
Right.
I can put my hand up and say, I definitely am in that category.
Mm-hmm.
When I was learning how to teach TOEFL, and also when I was actually studying for TOEFL, I had to completely change my note-taking style, because in normal academic lectures, I'm the person who's sitting there writing pages and pages, and I really like writing notes and it's great and I'm getting loads of good information. But
Right.
I found that that strategy for TOEFL wasn't so successful, because
Right.
I was concentrating on writing notes and I wasn't concentrating on listening to the information.
I see.
So I think whatever your tendency is,
Mm.
whatever your normal style is, you can probably reduce the number of words. So I think if you need a guideline, yes, kind of like around 5 to 7 words per
Mm.
line. You don't want more than that.
Right.
But
Right.
you can probably reduce it a little bit more
Mm.
just by focusing on listening and understanding rather than concentrating on note taking.
Right. Okay.
But we'll come on to that in
Sure.
a minute.
Mm.
Okay.
Great.
So, well, here we are. Let's now talk about how you can actually combine note taking with listening at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing to consider is, really, we are talking about skills building when we're talking about this. We are not It's not a good idea to jump straight into exam style practice. So to start listening to a really long lecture, put yourself under pressure to get all the information when you're first negotiating this, when you're first learning these strategies and these tactics.
Mm.
And if you can divide what you're doing into small steps, then that will help you. So the idea with all of the things that I'm talking about here is you need to practice them and to repeat them before they start becoming second nature, before you start feeling comfortable with them. So it's not, you shouldn't put yourself under pressure to try and do absolutely everything at once, but take it slowly, take it in slow, small steps to get the most out of it. And when we're talking about building strategies for understanding listening resources, we think about the listening section itself, but actually you can use other resources. And when I'm working with students who need a lot of help with listening, I often completely ignore the listening section for a while, and we go to either integrated lectures or speaking question lectures. And the reason for that is because they are much shorter and they're structured in a way that you can still find the main details, the supporting details, but it's not such an enormous task as listening to a 5-minute lecture on a topic that you find really, really difficult. So don't be afraid to use other resources, for things that they weren't necessarily intended for. You can use an integrated lecture from a writing question that you've already done, or speaking questions that you've already done. It doesn't matter that you're not seeing it for the first time, but the point is that you're using that material to practice and to build your skills. And it really is a case of, you take it slowly to start with, but you'll find that you make a lot of progress, a lot of really good progress. And it's almost like you're slowing down to speed up. That's what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what you said about cognitive load, right? Like there's less of a cognitive load. There's less things that you have to keep in your mind when you're just focusing on a 1-minute, audio file compared to a 5-minute audio file.
Precisely. And I mean, the thing about that as well is, I think a lot of people are reluctant to go back to questions that they've already done, because they kind of think it's, you know, cheating in a way because they know the information. But that's not the point with this. The point is that you're practicing skills so that you can actually do something with that information. It doesn't matter if you've already come across it. What you're doing is skills building. You know, you're using it for another purpose.
Right. Yeah, I think it depends on the student's level and goals. Like, you know, so some people are in a hurry, they just want their TOEFL score quickly, you know, they just want to get it over with. And then other people are like, you know, okay, I didn't get the score I want. There's some things missing. And how do I get to where I need to be? And so if they need to build those skills, then I think starting small is great advice in general, you know, for any of the sections, really.
I think as well, I mean, that's, you know, that's sort of a good point. Yes, a lot of people are in a hurry. They want to get their scores. They've got deadlines to meet. That's perfectly understandable. But so much of the TOEFL exam and so much of language generally is about listening and understanding. So in 3 sections of the TOEFL exam, you've got to prove that you've listened, that you've understood the information, you've remembered the information, and you can actually do something with it. So I think sometimes, you know, there's a tendency to brush over these kinds of skills in favor of just practicing speaking. But if your speaking is wonderful, if your accent is clear, you know, your delivery is great, that doesn't really matter if you've missed the second point in the lecture and you can't remember it, and you can't remember what the professor said as an example. You know, so everything is interconnected, and taking time sometimes just to start with these things means that you actually make much faster progress in other sections.
That's a good point. Yeah, so by building those skills, then you can actually make more progress, even though it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So let's talk about 3 exercises that I like to share to help build these skills. So the very first one is to listen and take no notes at all. So I must be clear, I'm not advising this as an exam strategy. I'm advising this just as an exercise to try, because I've done this a lot of times and everyone is always amazed at how much they do remember by just not taking notes at all. And like we were just saying, you know, you can give guidelines about you must write so many words per line, that sort of thing. But if you can rely on your memory and not take notes at all, that's actually a pretty good situation to be in, because it means that you can concentrate more on listening and understanding without being distracted by writing notes. You know, so of course the ultimate goal is to write some notes, but just to see how good your memory is, just to sort of see how effective this is, try this a couple of times and see what happens.
That's great.
The next exercise is connected with listening and understanding, but listen and paraphrase. So when you paraphrase, that means that I think I like to say, instead of summarizing, I don't really like using the word summarizing, I like to say re-explaining, because you're taking whatever the professor said, or you're taking whatever the speakers in the conversation said, and you're re-explaining what they said to somebody else. So if you think about it as paraphrasing or re-explaining, then that actually helps you to know how much you've understood. And the nice thing about this exercise, everything in language is connected. There are so many overlaps, and your brain really likes making those connections. So if you can connect listening and speaking for one of the exercises, then that means that you're exploring all that side of skills building as well. So it's definitely good to try, because it gives you an idea of how much you really have understood. If you haven't understood, then that's okay. You know, go back and listen again. But I've definitely worked with a lot of people who say, oh yeah, I understand it. No, I can't explain it. It's too difficult. And that's normally a sign that the understanding isn't as good as it should be.
Now, would you recommend doing this on like a sentence level or on a passage level, or, you know, so like would you recommend them paraphrasing like just a very short statement, or like paraphrasing the kind of whole passage? And also, should they paraphrase by speaking, or should they write down what they paraphrase?
So first of all, I think it's good to do at least sort of 3 or 4 sentences at a time. I mean, if you think about, I know you can't actually see a paragraph when you're listening, but if you kind of think about dividing it into sections.
Okay.
For example, if you're doing this with speaking task 4, then listen to the whole of the first thing that the professor is talking about.
Okay.
There's normally a thing, you know, like a strategy or a theory or something that the professor talks about. Then they give an example. So I'd say keep that together. It's difficult to paraphrase for something that's very short. You kind of get yourself into a lot of complicated situations with that. And then for the second part, I generally connect it with speaking, because I think there's a really sort of close relationship between listening and speaking, but you could easily use it as a writing exercise as well. You know, that would work nicely. So 2 ways of doing it, really.
Great.
Okay, and then the third exercise, and I think this is used quite a lot, but I really like this one. But with this one, the idea is that you listen to something twice. And you kind of have to be a little bit disciplined, because the first time you listen, you just focus completely on the main idea. That's all you're listening for. You're not concentrating on examples or minor details or anything like that. It's just purely the main idea. But then the second time you listen, focus on the details. So it's like you're filling in the information from what you've listened to previously. And a really nice way of doing it is to actually use different color pens, because then you can see what information you've added the second time. You can see what you got the first listening for the main idea, then you can see what you got for the second time. And this is actually really helpful for not just the listening section, but the speaking section as well. Because one of the key skills that you need to demonstrate in TOEFL is that you can separate the main idea from the supporting details. And your focus really should always be on getting that main idea. If you get some of the details, but you miss the main idea, you'll find that some of the listening questions are really hard to actually answer. And you'll be penalized in the speaking section if you don't get that main information.
Yeah, I mean, one question I have, I mean, this is kind of a big question, but it's probably,
okay.
It's not, but so how do you tell a difference, you know, between a main idea and a detail? You know, so I have some students who ask, like, you know, or, you know, they get the main idea wrong, or, you know, something like that. Is there any, it's probably not a quick answer, and depends on the context, you know, so it's one of those types of questions, but any ideas in general for finding the main idea?
So I think one of the ways that you can do, one of the ways that you can do it is if you can actually tell the story by focusing on the main ideas. If you can kind of get from the start of the lecture to the end of the lecture, and if you've got all the main ideas, then you'll find that you can accurately retell the lecture. If you focus too much on the details, you'll find that you don't really have a point to make. I don't know if that sort of makes much sense, but
yeah, no, that makes it a main idea you can kind of expand on. You know,
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
a detail you can't really. That's something I talk about with TOEFL reading summary questions. Um,
right,
you know,
right.
to tell the difference between a main idea and so not main idea, but a kind of summary statement and a
Yeah,
detail is like, does the statement, would you have more to say about this or not?
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and so I think it's one, yeah, kind of like, you know, heuristic, and like kind of like one way to kind of think about it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Let me show you the next slide, because I
Sure.
think this might actually answer the question as well.
Great.
So let's just kind of move us over here for the moment. Um, So this is an example of this. It's kind of nice and clear because I was doing it deliberately for teaching purposes.
Okay.
And also, despite, you know, what I said about use a pencil, I've actually used 2 colored pens because we're doing this exercise. But this is from a task 4 lecture, a
Okay.
speaking task 4 lecture. So the stuff in the blue, these are the main ideas. So this is about a lecture about mountain animals that live at high altitudes in the mountains, and they live on very steep ground. And
Mhm.
so they have special features that help them to cope with that environment.
Okay.
So if I look at my notes in blue, I can say that the first feature is that they've got strong muscles,
Mhm.
and that means that they can climb in the mountain.
Okay.
And then an example of this is that goats have got very strong chest muscles.
Mm.
Then the second example is that some animals have got specially adapted feet that mean that they don't slip in this steep mountain environment. And an example of this are sheep that live in the mountains.
Right.
So all I'm doing with that is just really focusing on the main thread of the lecture.
Mm.
But then, of course, to get a lot of extra points and to do really well, you want to be able to add in the details. But the point is that the main idea, you could actually just explain the main idea and have an, you know, a good understanding of what the lecture is about. But it's like the details are the sort of extra little bits that make it a bit more interesting, I suppose.
Right. Right.
Does that
That
make
makes more
sense?
sense. Yeah. Yeah. That makes more sense. And then the you know, of course, on the test they can't listen twice, right? So this is like building skills, you know, and trying to get
Exactly.
better at figuring out the difference between main idea and details. Um,
Exactly.
and you know, is there any advice that, you know, sometimes students ask, like, you know, what's important, you know, what should I write down? uh would you, is there anything that you would kind of, some general thing that you might say in that situation?
Yes, and I
Yeah.
have got a slide about that. I don't
Good.
know if it's the
Great.
next one,
Great.
but
We'll get to
I
it.
will come
We'll
to
get to it.
that.
We'll get to it. We'll get to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me just make sure that I can actually move forward. Right. So here is, as if by magic, the answer to your question. So whenever you're listening, you want to focus on what the important points are. But of course, knowing what the important points are is one of the skills that you really need to practice.
Right.
But the focus is on listening and understanding. And this again comes from sort of combining lots and lots of different elements of practicing. But if you can listen and understand, then you're definitely in a good position to know that you've got the information that you need.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically, when you're listening to the professor, listen for transition words and phrases. So if the professor says, now let's focus on the first thing, and then you get some information, then you hear the professor say, now we'll look at the second point. As soon as you hear that, stop. it's really tempting to keep writing and to think, oh, I'm just going to add, you know, some extra details onto the end of my notes, but don't. Because if you carry on finishing off your notes from the first point, you'll miss the beginning of the second point. And a lot of the important information is often right at the beginning. So it takes quite a lot of discipline to do that. It's something that I find really difficult. But the best advice that I've ever received is that you just physically stop, and then you actually start listening, and then it's almost like a little reset button. You know, you start sort of thinking, okay, we're on the second point now, and definitely make sure that that's something that you do. The other thing as well, I mean, really, when anyone is speaking, they do lots of things to draw your attention to the important points. So one of the things is to repeat or to explain something. So if the professor is repeating, explaining, using different words to say the same thing, that's an indication that it's important. And then also, I have always found it useful to make note of any numbers or any dates, because they invariably feature in some of the detail questions, or they're important enough in the speaking questions or the writing assignment that you need that information. So anytime you hear numbers, dates, anything like that, and then whenever, I think I said this in repetition, but whenever an example is given, whenever there's a further explanation, that's normally a sign that, you know, it's something important as well.
You know, while you were speaking, I was thinking, you know, what would be not important? What's something I could hear that would be not important? I was trying to think of it, because some of this advice I've given before.
Yeah.
And, you know, one thing that's kind of similar with repetition is like a rhetorical question.
Yes.
You know, what comes after a rhetorical question? So something like, you know, how would this look in the real world? Well, and then they give an example after. And so I think that, these ideas like repetition and transition words, you know, first of all, and the second example, I think that's all great. And then I was thinking, you know, if I'm a student, what can I miss? You know, and I was trying to think what I can miss, and I don't know exactly. I
don't think there's a definite rule for, or, you know, definite guideline for what you can miss. But I think if you focus on, if you can, it goes back to listening and understanding. If you can work out why the professor is doing something, why the professor is mentioning an example, then that gives you an idea of when you get down to that really detailed level that you can kind of not exactly relax, but you can certainly think, yeah, okay, I've got this point. I don't need all that additional information to explain it.
That makes sense.
I think it's kind of treating it at that level more than anything else.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, that like, so, you know, a lot of times with this test, you know, they over-explain things because they're teaching something. And so, you know, if you get the point, you're like, okay, I got the point. I understand what this is. And then you can kind of not tune out, but at least not really worry not really too much about writing every little detail down. Good.
Yeah. I think if you focus on listening so that you can explain it to somebody, that gives you a pretty good guideline of how much information you do need and how much is really that sort of excess detail level that you can just, you know, discard.
Okay.
All right. There we go. So the next thing to mention really is that all this does take practice. It definitely is not something that you do it a couple of times and then you feel really good about it and you've got the hang of it. Transcripts definitely help. And I am a huge supporter of using transcripts when you're working on listening. If there's anything that you don't understand, sometimes just by looking at a transcript, it makes it all a lot clearer, because you see everything written out, you see the grammatical constructions that are being used. And I know that many TOEFL teachers talk about using transcripts. I use them all the time with my students. There's a ton of research that's been done to say how beneficial they are. But the point comes when listening really is listening, and you've got to train your ears to get really used to listening for those different clues, being confident in your own ability. And it really is kind of like going from training wheels to a racing bike. It's sort of, you've got to almost take a big jump at some point and think, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to really rely on what I'm hearing rather than what I'm actually seeing in front of me. So, you know, my message is really, yes, transcripts are wonderful. They're a brilliant study aid, but for really getting good at listening, you've got to practice without them at some point.
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah. And, you know, the message with all of this is that it does take time. Sometimes I've found that when I work with students and we are looking at listening, they get really frustrated because they feel that progress should happen a lot more quickly. It's not, you know, when you're practicing, it's not that progress isn't happening, but it just takes different amounts of time for different people.
Right.
And everything that you do to practice will be beneficial. So, you know, don't get frustrated. Just keep going with it.
Great.
And that's it. Thank you very much for watching and listening. I'm going to stop sharing now.
And again, people can find you at birkenheadenglish.com, and you do TOEFL prep. And do you teach anything? You said exam prep in general. Do you also teach IELTS and other things? Or?
No, I haven't. I've worked with a few students who, once they get into courses, they just need a little extra help with academic English. I've done a little bit of that. I haven't done IELTS yet. That's on my to-do list for 2020. I haven't jumped into that one yet.
Right, I see. Well, again, Jane, thank you so much for sharing all this. It's been really beneficial, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody watching has learned a lot. And I'll put a link to your site. People can check it out. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been fun, and I'm really appreciative of it. Thank you.
Sure.